And so you have kids who are walking around and they become points to you. And you're looking for mastery and you're looking for evidence and you're trying to figure out which one of 45 things in the IRLA you need to focus on next, right? You know that's happening, right? Yeah. What happened is we lost the forest for the trees a little bit. And the fact that that happened is okay. And not only is it okay, but it shows that growth has taken place because you've started to become more aware of those individual things. But the reality is, a one green reader is not 45 lists of different things. So let's take it back to the forest for a minute. Let's look at the big picture and see how these fit together. For those of you who do not know me, I started out as a high school Spanish teacher. I only wanted to teach high school my whole life. I am not artistic. I was the only cheerleader who couldn't do bubble letters, and I hate bulletin boards. You just need to, I taught high school. I taught British literature, AP Spanish, Spanish 1 through 4, and sophomore English. And the quarterback of my football team couldn't read. I don't mean he couldn't handle Macbeth. He could not decode the instructions on the test. And I thought, how do we not know how to read? It seems like through osmosis, through 12 years, we'd figure it out. So I moved down. I teach ESL, K-12. So I moved down. I teach middle. I teach elementary. And all of a sudden, I find myself working with K-1 teachers all day long, every day. Because I know as a teacher, and now I know as a mom, if we don't have this, it doesn't matter how good I can teach Macbeth. We can't have that kind of conversation. So what I want us to do, I know I'm talking to first grade teachers here, but we've got to know how these pieces fit together. Not only because we have outliers, but because we've got to know why our piece is so essential. And what's essential? Isn't that the stress of power goals? How do you know what's more important than another? So let's look back in the big picture, what's so important. Let's go back even farther over here. When a child comes in on the first day of kindergarten, if they are read to me, they're considered an emergency from the very first day. So tell me, what does that mean if a child isn't read to me? What can they not do?
They can't point to text. They don't have word-to-word correspondence. They're not getting their mouth ready.
Okay, even a step further behind than that.
They can't remember the pattern.
Pattern and picture cue. Okay, because in my son's class, he's reading 2 Blue. There's also the kid who licks him every day who sits beside him. Right? And his teacher is trying to figure out how to find text that's hard enough for A.J. Brown, and he's actually trying to keep him from licking people. So we have a kid who comes in the first day who does not have an experience with books. When I first started working for the company, AJ was about 3.5. And I come home, I've just gotten hired, I'm in Philadelphia, and I have my book. And AJ said, well, Mommy, tell me about where you've been. And I said, well, I've been learning about how to help students be better readers. And this is what kind of readers we are. He said, what kind of reader are you? I said, I'm a gold reader. He said, what kind of reader am I? So I said, well, I don't know, let's see. Now, you all have known me well enough. I read to that child since the day I knew I was pregnant. We've always read. But I didn't have one yellow books at my house. I didn't have pattern books. So I thought, gosh, I don't know if he's going to be reading to me or I don't know. So I got one of the yellow books and I read, I see a dog, I see a cat. And he said, I see a really creepy frog. And I looked at him, I said, how did you know that? Because he had had no direct instruction on pattern. He said, Mommy, that's how books work. Kids who come in who cannot follow that pattern and picture cue, who don't know I see A and something that makes sense in the picture, they're not one yellow. They're reading to me because they don't have that reading experience. They don't know how books work. So a one yellow reader could follow that pattern and use that picture cue. I see a really creepy frog. To move to 2 yellow then, what are they able to do? They're able to use that one-to-one correspondence. I say, I see a dog, I see a cat. They say, I see a. It can't be really creepy frog. There's only one word left. I see a frog. Take it a step further. What's a 3 yellow reader able to do?
They're getting their mouth ready.
They're getting their mouth ready for that initial sound. I see a, it starts with a t, t. Can't be frog, must be toad. Are we sounding out at any point during that? No. Are we reading at any point during that?
No.
No. And I'm still hearing, not just in Pasco, across the board, but I'm still hearing yellow readers be told to sound it out. That's not where they are yet. We're going to get there, but that's not where they are yet. We're using the pattern, one-to-one correspondence, and getting our mouth ready for the first sound. If we're reading a book about baseball and they say bat instead of base, but both are in the picture, it's okay. So then we move to 1 green and 2 green. Tell me first, where are we in terms of grade level for 1 green and 2 green? End of kindergarten, first third of first grade. First grade teachers, December 1st, we're going to shift to 1 blue. Right? Everybody went, okay. All about power words. In Spanish, the purpose of power words is different than English. In Spanish, almost every power word is decodable. They're just not decodable yet. Words like mamá, tema, tengo, all of those are decodable. They're just not decodable yet for kids. So power words in Spanish are really more high-frequency words. But in English, the purpose of power words is different. They are either, one, not decodable. You hear kids go t, h, the. Or they're words like am and an, where they're those familiar chunks that for the rest of their reading life, they're going to find that familiar chunk inside. Those words, you heard Marisa say a minute ago, they have to be islands of certainty. Imagine my driving record if every time I saw a stop sign, I had to go stop, stop, stop. Oh, stop. What would happen to me? I wouldn't have made it here this morning, right? When we see a stop sign, do you actually consciously read that sign? No, you see it and you know what to do. Power words need to be that way. When they see it, they need to know what it means. Am, and, the. That's why we say flash speed. It's not that there's after 2.3 seconds. No. You're never going to hear me say a number of seconds. They need to see it and know it. If kids are sounding out power words, they haven't learned their power words. Because, I'm going to say that again because you're writing. If kids are sounding out power words, they don't know their power words. Now you're making strides there because it took forever for AJ to learn those WH words. Were, where, and why. I didn't think we were ever going to learn those words. I had them written all over my house and like I would sing them and dance them until he was embarrassed. But they've got to know them that way. Because what we're going to be doing from that point on, from there to the end of second grade, we're going to tell them, find that word find that small word inside the bigger word. Well, if they don't know that smaller word, that strategy is not going to work for them. That's not going to make any sense. That is essential in the end of kindergarten, beginning of first grade. So first grade teachers, this is what we're expecting students to do independently, right? So this whole time, those 60 words not only needed to be included in instruction in kindergarten, but also in our classrooms as well. Once we move to 1 blue, the middle of first grade, that's all about chunking. Those 1-syllable words. So when students knew am, now they can read ham. When students know an, now they can read man. Because remember, in 1 green and 2 green, in addition to the power words, they also learn initial consonant sound and those blends. Okay? In 2 blue, the end of first grade, we're going to be moving to those 2-syllable words. Ham becomes hammer, can becomes candle. And I'll be honest, typically that 1 blue to 2 blue is usually a pretty easy shift. If kids have their power words and initial sounds down really well, they start to add that second syllable almost by themselves. I had a book by John Sanford, a novel, stuck in my pocketbook the other day. And AJ, he knows John because that's his middle name, but he said John and Sand or Ford. Sanford. Now, we haven't been reading 2-syllable words at our house and talking about it, but he knew immediately and or. Because why? Those power words are solid. So all you have to add to Sanford are those initial consonants. That 1 blue to 2 blue shift happens pretty easily if you have a solid foundation in green and 1 blue. Everybody hear what I just said? If you have a solid foundation in green and 1 blue, then that 2 blue shift should be pretty easy. When we move to 1 red, we've taken those 2 syllables to what? 3 syllables. Hammer becomes hammering. Candle becomes candlelight. And what I've noticed, I have no research behind to support what I'm about to say. But it should be just as easy to move from 1 syllable to 2 as it is from 2 to 3. But for some reason, when our kids get to those 3-syllable words, it's like they panic and they just read the beginning and make ups and they're like, instead of hammering, they'll go handlebar and they'll just keep going. I'm like, wait a minute. So a lot of those kids who in 1 red, you may need to return back to that same strategy we used in 1 blue and say, Whoa, it's not handlebar. Go back and find that small word inside that big word, just like you've been doing all along. Sometimes they need to be reminded it's not something new. Haven't you noticed that sometimes with our kids, when we add something new, they think it's completely different when you're just adding another piece to it? Don't we do that as teachers sometimes? We learned about leveling, and then we started focusing on routines, and we forgot about leveling. And once we moved to conferencing, we forgot about paying attention to routines. The same thing happens. So it's just reminding our kids, once they start having those longer words, no, go back and find that small word inside the big word, just like you did before. Moving to two-read, multisyllabic words, tricky words, irregularly spelled words. Two-read is huge. Two-read is the end of decoding. Students who leave two-read, not just get to two-read, but go through, they leave two-read on grade level, they have all of the decoding skills they need to read in their native language. In fact, in a transitional model, that's the perfect place to transition to a second language because they have all the decoding skills and strategies needed to do that. What that also means, for my quarterback in my Macbeth class, if you leave second grade with phonics gaps, you probably always have phonics gaps. That's why, what is the very first entry requirement on white?
Phonics gap locator.
Phonics gap locator. We cannot let kids get past that point with phonics gaps because they're not addressed again. That's why those pieces are so essential. There's an additional big idea or big learning in two-read, in addition to the multisyllabic tricky words. What else should students be doing once a week? Finishing a chapter book a week. That's huge. You see that in two-read and in white, but I want to stop and kind of talk about that for a minute. In two-read, we are still decoding. There's no figurative language yet. There's no academic vocabulary. Students are simply decoding that text. But what we need to know is before we move to white, to third grade text that has 1 or 2 academic vocabulary words per page, we've got to be sure that not only can they decode, but they're decoding at a speed that makes it where they can still comprehend and finish a book in a week. If every single word I'm going at, mattering, I'm the teacher and I'm bored and have forgotten what he just read. You know he has, right? So that's why that's an essential piece. Now when we talk about two-read and white, finishing a chapter book a week, that's one of the hardest things to get kids to do is not abandon books. That's hard, and I want to be transparent. That's hard. I mean, you feel like you need to chain it to them. But think about this. I love Dan Brown. Angels and Demons, The Da Vinci Code, I love those books. How many of you have read any of those types of books? Okay. The first 2 or 3 chapters aren't fun. You meet 99 characters. They're going different places. They're in different countries. Sometimes there's like Spanish in one and Italian in one. You're like, what's going on? Can you imagine reading books and never getting to the aha, to the connection, to the whodunit? That's what's happening to our kids. They were reading the part at the beginning that doesn't make any sense to us, and they're never figuring out why it matters. It takes sitting down with kids and saying, I agree. The first chapter of books never makes sense to me. They're trying to give us all these details, so if we keep reading, we'll figure out what's going on. We'll figure out who killed who and why, and it takes getting through that part. But it also takes telling kids, hey guys, this matters. I'm not going to let you leave two-read without finishing a chapter, but here's why. This is why it helps you. And it helps you because when we get into white, just as I said in third grade, we're going to start adding 1 to 2 chapter books per page, 1 to 2 academic vocabulary words per page. Instead of using said, the author's going to use muttered, stammered, whispered. Now, I don't speak German, but I could read a book that had 1 or 2 German words per page. I could do that. I could make meaning of it. It would be fine. But as you started to add 3 to 5, or 5 to 8, or 8 to 12, if there were 12 German words per page, I don't think I could make meaning of what I was reading anymore. And that's what we see happens to our kids. Their comprehension is kind of okay, and about 5th and 6th grade, their comprehension just tanks. But it's not that between 5th and 6th gets that much harder. It's that they finally get to the point where there's just too many words they don't understand, it doesn't make any sense anymore. So the idea is if we can decode 1 chapter book a week with meaning, we can slow down and we can figure out what those 1 or 2 words per page mean. We can cover that word up and think of a word that would make sense in its place and still finish that chapter book a week. Does that make sense? We've got to be able to do this because when we get into white, 4th grade is all about that high-speed silent reading. This is when kids get hooked in a series. Babysitter's Club, Boxcar Children, Wimpy Kid, Magic Treehouse, Goosebumps, all of those are in that are getting hooked on that series. I haven't read a Babysitter's Club book probably in 15 years, but I could write one in about 30 minutes. It's going to be told from the perspective of one of the babysitters, and either Logan, Marianne's boyfriend, or one of the other boys in the neighborhood is going to get involved. There's going to be something crazy that happens at school. They're going to lose one of the kids they babysit, but it's all going to come to be better, and they're going to get more business at the end. Right? How do I know that? You laughed. You read Babysitter's Club, didn't you? And wasn't that what every single one was about? When AJ was about 4, I realized that I travel all over the country and talk about reading to our kids. And I read to him, but I had never read a chapter book. We always just read different books at night. And I thought, I really need to be reading a chapter book to him. So I picked Captain Underpants. AJ is an animal nonfiction scientist. Like, if he's not a scientist one day, I'm not his mom. But when he sees fiction books, he calls them baby girl books. He doesn't want to read fiction. He says, they're pretend, I don't want to read that. So I thought, Captain Underpants, like that's a good boy book. He loved it. I felt like I was dumber for having read it, but he loved it. He said, we've got to get number 2. So I buy the second one, and they're really expensive too, by the way. So I buy the second one, and I read the first page, and he said, Mommy, this Captain Underpants book starts the same way as the other Captain Underpants book started. I said, it did? What do you mean? He said, we have the 2 boys, and they're wearing the tie, and if you've read them, they always introduce the exact same way. So my little teacher brain starts, and I said, what else do you think is going to be in this Captain Underpants book? He said, a flip-a-rama fight, and the principal's going to turn into Captain Underpants, and he starts naming. What was he already starting to do?
Make connections.
Make connections and see that to be a Captain Underpants book, you've got to have these pieces. So we ended up reading all 10. By the time we finished, he had already turned 5. I'm definitely dumber now for having read all 10 of those books. But he loved them. He loved them. So I walk into my office not too long ago, and he has copier paper everywhere in my floor. And I would like to say that I was real patient. I said, AJ, what's going on? That's not what I said. I was like, what are you doing? He said, Mommy, I'm writing my own Captain Underpants book. And so I put my mommy aside, and I turned to my teacher for a minute, and I said, how do you know it's a Captain Underpants book? And he showed me. He had his first page with the 2 little boys wearing that same outfit, introducing them. He had the flip-a-rama fight. He had the principal, when you snap his fingers, he turns into Captain Underpants. He had Captain Underpants getting water spilled on him and winning at the end and turning into the principal. He understood that to be a Captain Underpants book, you had to have these pieces. Kids who don't get hooked on a series don't know that authors write a certain way for a reason. That's essential, because when we get into 5th and 6th grade and we're expanding into different genres, if I say poetry, how do you know it's poetry? What are going to be some things that will tell you it might be poetry? Stanzas. What else? Words rhyme. Symbols. Y'all are getting so nervous. It's hilarious. How do you know something's a letter?
Opening and closing.
Opening and closing. First thing, okay? How do I know something may have a flashback? What's something that may tell me it's a flashback? Okay, a dream sequence. You're getting nervous because I'm starting to get into your but how do you know that poetry's poetry? How did you know stanzas? That told me that at some point she's what? Read a poem. When I said a letter and somebody immediately said opening and closing, you've probably seen a letter. Students who haven't seen not only how one genre works, but how genres can be different, and in fact are different on purpose, they can't make connections to that. I'm going to pick on yesterday's group a little bit. I was explaining in Atlanta, I'm from Atlanta, and in Atlanta on Martin Luther King Day, when you are in middle school, everybody does the same thing. You read Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, and you read George Wallace's speech on the steps of University of Alabama. And my intention was to ask, how are those 2 things different? But I noticed about 3/4 of the room looked away from me, like, please don't call on me. And I realized most of those teachers have not read at least one of those 2 things. So no matter how great I talk about comparisons between those 2 things, if you haven't read them yourself, can you make those connections? That's what happens with our kids. If they haven't read those different genres and different structures, they can't make any of those comparisons, and that's what happens when we get into middle school and students are working on author craft and bias and perspective. When I was in high school, I took a college class. So I walk in on the first day and I'm trying not to look like a high schooler. I'm trying to just sit there and be cool because that guy's 20 and I'm trying to be cool. And the professor walks in, and the very first sentence he says is so inappropriate I can't say it in front of you all. And so of course, like, they're just like, whatever. And I said, oh, I couldn't believe a teacher walked in and said that in front of everybody. He said, and now that I have your attention, let's start public speaking. What was his point? What do good public speakers do?
They have a grabber.
They grab your attention. Now, is the only way to grab people's attention by saying something inappropriate? No. The first thing I said was I talked about my kindergartner who's reading on 2 Blue. So how did I get your attention?
You put our mind frame into you.
I made a connection, and I let you know that I understand exactly where you are today, because I do it at school, but I also do it at home. People who don't understand, who haven't had those connections to other types of structure and genre, don't understand that we can use words or structures to be persuasive or to be biased. I was working with some teachers in Baltimore not long ago, and I was trying to talk about author's word choice, and they were really having a hard time understanding what I was talking about. So I said, okay, I'm going to describe you one of 2 ways. I'm going to describe you as frugal, and then I'm going to describe you as cheap. And you tell me if that's okay. Well, when I said frugal, they were, 3/4 of them were like, okay, that's fine. But when I said cheap, they all do what you did. They giggled. They were like, oh no. Those 2 things mean the same thing in the dictionary. But why did you giggle when I said you were cheap? But you just kind of nodded when I said you were frugal. Why? It was the connection, the connotation. When I picture frugal, I picture a really responsible dad taking care of money, being responsible. She said it sounded more fancy. But when I said cheap, I pictured red lipstick. Right? But students who don't see that authors make certain choices are never going to come to the conclusion that those choices are purposeful for whatever their purpose is. So then we get into high school, what I was teaching, literary analysis and writing as art and rhetoric. And I was teaching one day that different symbols of nature are used to represent things in life. And so that day I asked my students, I said, what does water frequently represent in literature? Write it down real quick. My cronies here in the front are writing, and the ones in the back are going. And so I give them a minute, and I said, okay guys, what does water frequently represent? And my crew here are like, passage of time, time passing, life passing. I said, yep. And Michelle in the back, whom I love and have a great rapport, she goes, like Dr. B, where is this in the book? Because I have no idea what you're talking about. I said, okay. You have to back up and punt mid-class. I said, okay. Tell me how you knew water represents a passage of time. And somebody said, a separate piece, a river runs through it. And they start naming things they had read where water represented the passage of time. And guess what she said? I read those things. So no matter what great discussion I had planned, was she ever going to make those connections on her own? No. So in other words, what we've just said is we can't get here if we can't talk about how authors make choices. And we can't talk about how authors make choices if we haven't read in different genres. And we're not going to understand those different genres unless we get hooked on our own series and can finish a chapter book a week and understand that academic vocabulary. We can't do that if we can't decode multisyllabic words quickly enough to be able to read that chapter book a week. And that's not going to happen if we can't use 3 and 2 and 1 syllable words by finding our power words inside those words. That's why we're here in kindergarten and first grade today. Because the quote that comes up, is it on here, Marisa? Historically, only 1 in 10 kids who are behind after first grade ever catch up. Why? No matter how good these pieces are, without that and without this, the rest doesn't matter. That's why we're here today, is to be sure that our students do not have gaps. Now, I want to be real and transparent for a minute. I have 2 groups of teachers and administrators in here, and I don't know who's who. I have those of you who hear me say accelerate reading growth, and we've been jumping from entry to entry to entry to move them as quickly as you can because I've told you to accelerate reading growth. I have. I also have those of you who heard me say we don't want gaps and are so terrified of moving kids, you're marking every box and every level and you still don't want to move them. Both of you are doing what I've said to do. Our purpose today is to bring those 2 together and say, okay, what's the big idea of that level? And what matters most? Does that make sense? That's a lot of information. Let's take about 5 minutes, go get some caffeine, go to the restroom, and come back. And let's take what we just talked about and bring it into conferencing.